Now, plenty more topics to discuss as far as global trade is concerned. Let's bring in Ali Hamoudi, CEO at ATIA Global, joining us now from Dubai. So let's start with the question of fossil fuel subsidies. I know reforming that is on the agenda at this very meeting. Many economies, though, are struggling to deal with the surge in energy prices. So politicians are very reluctant to raise energy prices, at least in the short run. What sort of solutions are being debated at this event?
Well, thanks for having me. And indeed, I mean, we all know that the fossil fuel subsidy reform seeks to rationalize and phase out inefficient fossil fuel use among the WTO members. But while there has been commitments, agreement, and discussions within the World Trade organizations, there has been limited progress on fossil fuel subsidy reform. And as you said, there is the likelihood of reaching a full agreement, I think, is a little bit optimistic, because we know some developing countries are fearful that rich countries will use the climate-related trade policies as a weapon against them to penalize imports from the developing countries. So this tension, I think, will always remain, especially now when as you know, after COVID we had the Russia-Ukraine war. So it's basically not helping all of these geopolitical situations, putting pressure on prices for all nations to reach an agreement.
Indeed. In agriculture, of course, agriculture reform, as just mentioned in my earlier speaker, a reporter in Abu Dhabi, that's been a long-running topic of discussion at these events, often with very, very little progress over the last decade or two. Can you give us a sense of why it's been so hard to get any concrete agreement on agreeing on how we should handle trade rules around the export and importation of food?
I mean, because we know, with the WTO negotiations, they entail various topics, including domestic support, supporting the market access, the export competition, export restrictions, public stockholding for food for security, for example, purposes. It's also an issue. So all of these make it very difficult, especially after COVID, where we have seen countries basically look after themselves. We're going to look after the interests of our nation. So all of this makes it very, very difficult. But I think to reach consensus on such major reforms will be very hard, this time around, especially when, as you said, more related to settlements, dispute settlements in agriculture, fisheries, subsidies. All of this, I think, will still have a long way to go.
Especially at a time when governments in Europe, for example, are facing, protests by farmers pretty much up and down across the bloc, from Spain to Ireland, Germany to France, and they have EU elections coming up in another couple of months. So from their perspective, their concern is more domestic. Whatever happens elsewhere in the world is not really their priority.
Indeed. I mean, this is another risk, I guess. Even if they will agree on something, then you might have an election in the US where Trump is president, and basically he throws, as he did before, all the agreements done today, to the wall. So that remains a big risk, I think.
There's a proposal on the table from the Cairns Group, I believe, over the last few months, which proposes a 50% cut to agricultural subsidies by 2034. And I know I'm sort of asking you if you think we can actually have a sort of miraculous agreement on this, given the political environment in the EU and, of course, in the United States as well. But do you think there's any possibility of an agreement on that front?
I mean, it contains such a complex calculation method for setting the new limits while having total, global entitlements to provide all kinds of support for, the stored prices and output. So I think it remains the outstanding problem. I don't think, in short, basically, it will see the day of light this time around anyway.
Right. One last question for you. South Africa and India, they were opposing extending, I believe it's a 15-year moratorium on applying tariffs on digital trade. Is their position informed purely by the tax losses that governments say they incur when a lot of these Western tech giants are providing services outside of their home countries, but those services are not necessarily taxable?
I mean, yes, and some countries see it as basically guaranteeing stability for e-commerce trade and an important tool for development. But other developing members question, its impact on revenues and policy-making capacity, and they view it basically as maintaining a permanent digital divide between rich and poor countries, if you like. So developing countries argue that letting it expire would basically jeopardize a global e-commerce recovery. And indeed, yes, India and South Africa, joined by Indonesia and perhaps several others, demand that the expiration of the moratorium, so that governments can use this policy space to raise revenue and nurture domestic industries. And one final thing I would like to mention, that a continued and prolonged impasse at the WTO, as we have seen maybe before, could bode ill for developing and low-income countries who would likely to stand more to gain than high-income countries. So a higher share of their trade is dependent on WTO most favored nations tariff, for example. So these countries also can benefit from the capacity building efforts from the WTO. So consensus is in their favor, basically.